when students come and enroll and they say, what can I use? What can I do? What is going to get me thrown out if I do this? What's considered cheating nowadays? All of those are questions that schools need to be on top of and need to be clear about that side of things.
The recent Tomorrow's MBA study by consultancy CarringtonCrisp highlights some key changes in how students view international MBA programs, concentrations, and the role of artificial intelligence. I'm speaking with Andrew Crisp, co-founder of CarringtonCrisp, to talk about their findings around global MBA preferences and how geopolitical tensions, evolving student expectations, and the rise of AI are reshaping business education worldwide. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Ray. It's a pleasure to join you.
Wonderful to have you here. Let's jump right into the study, the latest Tomorrow's MBA study. It showed something quite surprising to me, a dramatic drop in interest for international MBA study for students seeking to go outside of their country and look elsewhere. It went from 39% to just 19%. Now, clearly this data was collected before some of the recent visa restrictions in the United States and geopolitical tensions. However, do you see any connection between this shift and any specific political developments?
Look, I think these changes were baked in before we even had the November election and the recent changes in terms of the tone, certainly, of the conversation. Just look around the world. If it wasn't in the US, we already had visa restrictions here in the UK when the government last year said dependents couldn't travel to come to the UK with people studying for the postgraduate degrees. We have restrictions in Canada in terms of the work that international students can do. We have restrictions being discussed in Australia in their election campaign at the very moment that this podcast is being recorded. We have restrictions in the Netherlands being debated and discussed. So this trend of geopolitical or political, domestic political shifts in the market are very much a feature that have been baked in for some time. This isn't new. We've seen it coming. And you add on top of that concerns that perhaps students have about the cost of housing as a simple issue. If you're going to spend a year or even 2 years studying for an MBA outside your home country, then that's going to be a significant element as well that needs to be considered on top of, let alone, can I get a visa to study? Can I bring my partner? Can my partner get a job while I'm studying? All of those sort of questions.
That reminds me of my time at Cornell in New York City, trying to recruit students for the Johnson Cornell Tech MBA and actually providing housing in New York City, because that is a key challenge.
It is indeed. It is indeed. And you go beyond that, and the student then says, okay, maybe I can afford this. Maybe I'm going to get a visa. What's going to happen afterwards? Do I get a visa that allows me to stay and work for 2 or 3 years? Because that's a key element for many in terms of paying back the fees that they've invested in the course of study in the first place. And there are question marks around some of those. Add in a market in terms of the labor market that says maybe that boom in tech companies recruiting MBAs over the past 2 or 3 years has softened somewhat. That we know that the financial markets are not as strong recruiters as they have been historically. And all of a sudden, it's not quite a perfect storm, but it's certainly heading that way, and it breeds uncertainty. And that's what I think you see in the data that we have today.
I'd love to dig into that a little more. I mean, clearly STEM programs received special visa considerations and were among the most popular, are still among the most popular. And the largest sending country for a long time for American business schools had been China. Now, at the time of this recording, there is an escalating trade tension, I could call it a trade war, between U.S. and China, as well as other economic rivals. How might these emerging geopolitical dynamics impact MBA enrollment patterns in American business schools over the next few years? What do you think?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was at a conference, a GMAT conference in January this year in Arizona, and I talked to one of the schools from the southern states, and they said last August, so when they were closing or just coming towards the close of their first round applications for this coming September, they were 22% up in international applications.
Wow.
Come December, they were 18% down. And of course, we all know what changed in the period between August and December.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's perception more than anything else. There is a perception of not necessarily hostility, because that would be unfair, but a perception of, do I really need this added complication? Could I go somewhere else? Are there good business schools elsewhere in the world? Might I even think about studying domestically and not uprooting my life and not adding extra costs in terms of these things we were just talking about, like housing, etc.? Because look at the rankings. Look at the rankings, how they've changed over the last 10 or 20 years, and the entry at the upper levels of those rankings of great Asian business schools in China, in India, in Singapore, in a number of other countries, who are clearly delivering a great product and having great outcomes for the students that are studying there, and perhaps offer a career trek, perhaps offer a study exchange, perhaps offer a short-term exposure with a partner school in the US, so you can put 3 months or a semester on your CV, spent to the US school, but do it studying at a domestic institution.
That brings to mind something very interesting that was also in the report about a shift towards on-campus programs. You know, I always assumed that was a dying breed, that you watch what's happening, especially at American business schools, where full-time programs are being made part-time. They're being made hybrid. Many schools, Arizona State University and others, have launched fully online MBA programs. But we see this shift now towards the traditional full-time on-campus program. What's driving this, to me, contradiction? When it seems like online and hybrid are the future, but why is it based on that sort of locality that you were talking about?
I think it's other things as well. I think what you have got is, part of it is a return to the office, which is part of the psychology that's going on. And so people are thinking, maybe I've had enough of Teams, I've had enough of Zoom meetings, I want to get some real face-to-face experience. And quite often, when we survey students and ask them about the possibility of doing an online MBA, they say, well, it's great, flexibility, convenience, but I'd kind of like 30% of the time in the classroom. I'd like to meet my classmates. I'd like to meet the professors. I'd like to make use of the facilities on campus. We are, as individuals, humans, we are social animals. And having some of that face-to-face, despite all the advantages of the technology in terms of learning, is a big plus. I think the other thing to see is that the MBA is not one marketplace. It's many marketplaces. And so the popularity of online and blended and hybrid and whatever you want to call them is driven by a growth in the marketplace itself, by allowing perhaps people who would never have thought of going and doing a full-time 2-year MBA, suddenly I have this access. And I have this access at a well-known school, a well-known brand, apart from anything else. The other part of it is a little bit of a flee to quality. If you're thinking about an MBA and perhaps you've been made redundant, or you're worried about that, or you're thinking about where your next job is coming from, then I want a real stamp of a top school on my CV. And that is perhaps driving a little bit of a trickle back to campus as well.
That brings up another question, just sort of off of that, where you see selectivity differ between MBA programs with certain concentrations and then master's degrees within those same business schools that may be in that same discipline. Are you seeing any shift there, or do you anticipate any shift based on concentrations and what's popular among students?
It's really interesting. So this has been something that again has been evolving over time. We've been doing this study now for 15 years, and we see a growing interest in specialized programs, whether that's master's or MBA. And one of the themes inevitably over the last 3 or 4 years has been an interest in technology, especially AI. I read a great piece recently which said, look, I did my MBA 10 years ago. Nobody was talking about AI. Nobody was teaching AI 10 years ago. So I need to find a way of adding that sort of content. And if you're fresh to the MBA market, then it's going to be a prerequisite that any program you might do has that element in there. But we're also seeing some other interesting specialisms. Healthcare is one that's come very much to the fore in recent years, whether that's because people are living longer, whether it's because of the COVID impact, whether it's a digitalization of healthcare. There seems to be a big demand in that area. You go a little bit further down and you have the issues like, of course, sustainability has very much been on the radar of many people in recent years. And alongside that, you have things like renewables in terms of energy coming to the fore. And then you have some really interesting sort of slightly creative options. We run a study as well as the Tomorrow's MBA one on Tomorrow's Masters, and we ask there about what people want to study. We give them a great big long list. And 12% said they'd be interested in a space and satellite technology speciality. And you sort of sit back and you think, okay, probably that does make sense, because if I'm 21, 22, 23, I see Elon Musk, I see Jeff Bezos, I see Richard Branson. If I'm in India or China, I see the States there getting involved in the space industries. I see even Norway recently, they tried to launch a rocket into space. It failed on this occasion, but it won't be the last time. Here in Cornwall, where we're based, we have a spaceport just up the road where they're looking at satellite technologies. And so thinking about the changes across business and industry in the wider society is a really good way for business schools to think about what's next. Where will the demand be in terms of these specializations?
It's fascinating. At the time of this recording, Katy Perry just returned from space. I'm a Katy Perry fan. I'll admit that to all my listeners. But it is interesting to see, that interest in space is a given, I think. And healthcare has been a big area of focus, and sustainability has been a focus within business programs for a long time. AI, though, has sort of come out of left field, and I'm not sure how many business schools are really prepared. The Tomorrow's MBA study shows that it's the most valued tech-related MBA program. 43% said that. So I imagine there's a shift and maybe a divide between business schools that are embracing this and putting this into their curricula, and those that maybe are still kind of wondering what they should be doing, or even are concerned or afraid about MBA academic integrity and what an AI component would do to that. What do you think is going to happen? Who's being successful? What is the secret sauce?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think whether it's come out of nowhere, whether it's part of a wider digital transformation trend that we've seen for a few years, schools certainly have been getting on board. I think the first step is really policy. What is our policy about AI? When students come and enroll and they say, what can I use? What can I do? What is going to get me thrown out if I do this? What's considered cheating nowadays? All of those are questions that schools need to be on top of and need to be clear about that side of things. Second part then is students, 79% in the survey said it was very important or extremely important that their school taught them how to use AI in the workplace, because they read everywhere that this is happening. And whilst, for some, it may simply be using technology that helps translate recordings of meetings, for others, it's far more sophisticated. It's chemical and academic and medical research that AI is really leading. And so helping them understand that, getting the case studies, bringing them forward quickly, making sure they're up to date. And that has always been a barrier for some schools, that the case studies are somewhat out of date, that they're about things that happened a decade ago. And whilst they're insightful, they're not topical. They're not right out. So schools that are doing that, schools that I heard a Wharton professor explaining how they could take a headline from today's, I was going to say newspaper, but let's say today's podcast perhaps, and turn that into a case study with a few prompts. And so making new case studies in real time. The other interesting thing we're seeing a little bit of is collaboration between business schools and schools that have a heavy technology emphasis. So here in Europe, a good example would be St. Gallen University, which is a great business school in Switzerland, now has an executive MBA jointly delivered with a school called ETH Zurich, which is very much on the technology side of things and the engineering and life sciences, that side of things. So I think that is a good signal in terms of a school. And of course, business schools and comprehensive universities will often have a faculty down the road doing computer science and can leverage that opportunity.
That makes a lot of sense. And we've seen that trend in the US and places I've worked at STEM institutions where there's a synergy between the engineering school and the business school. But you mentioned Wharton, and it brings to mind the incredible cost of attendance of some of these MBA programs. And even I think Wharton has a $100,000 online MBA. Is it becoming questionable? Is it given the growing popularity of alternatives, and not necessarily certificates or even specialized masters, but just getting different kinds of qualifications, different kinds of work experiences, are MBAs living up to their value proposition, or what could they do to better articulate their value proposition given the cost of attendance, or can they do that?
Well, there seems to be a strong demand still for the MBA. We started this study the year of the global financial crisis, 2009, because at the time there were a lot of headlines talking about this is the end of the MBA, the MBAs are all to blame for the state we're in, et cetera, et cetera. Well, 15 years on, there's still a healthy demand for MBAs. In fact, probably a larger demand for MBAs, driven by new technology, new ways to learn, new ways to slice and dice an MBA into modules and the such like. But I think it's still a really important question you ask. Is the ROI of an MBA still absolutely clear? And I think one of the things that business schools do need to think about is how up to date, as we've just discussed, some of the content is. Is it relevant not just to today, but to tomorrow? Is it flexible enough in as much as can I think the phrase is pimp my MBA, add some sort of specialization to it, which may be outside of the curriculum. And I think business schools are increasingly in a good place to do this. A lot of them have what you just described, these certificates, these short courses, but they almost need to work as curators because there's so much choice out there. If I want a course on Python, do I watch 8 videos on YouTube? Do I go to a specialist on Coursera? Do I go to the university itself and say, what can you offer? What I need to know as a student is where is the best use of my time? And anything that the business school can do to help me with that judgment is going to be valuable. So really, personalization, I think, is the overall message here. Help me to make the most of your MBA.
You can read more about the Tomorrow's MBA study and all the great work of CarringtonCrisp in the show notes below. Andrew Crisp, co-founder of CarringtonCrisp, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It was a pleasure talking to you, Ray.
So here's my take. Andrew clearly showed how multiple competing factors are shaping the future of MBA education globally. These include career-driven and global issues. While the focus of online education in the U.S. has been growing, I'm really intrigued by the tension between students becoming more locally focused while simultaneously craving that traditional in-person experience. On top of that, business schools are wrestling with artificial intelligence. They're essentially facing the same disruption they teach about in their curricula. The institutions that will thrive will be those that can articulate their unique value and keep their course content up to date while adapting to rapidly changing student priorities and technological advances.